This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Here we go. Chapter 10 now of The History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. If you're not appreciating this book, what's wrong with you? Okay, Chapter 10. The second stage of the Gould fortune. The first medium by which Jay Gould transferred many millions of dollars to his own ownership was by his looting and wrecking of the Erie Railroad. If physical appearance were to be accepted as a gauge of capacity, none would suspect that Gould contained the elements of one of the boldest and ablest financial marauders that the system in force had as yet produced. About 5 feet 6 inches in height and of slender figure, he gave the random impression of being a mild, meek man, characterized by excessive timidity. His complexion was swarthy and partly hidden by closely trimmed black whiskers. His eyes were dark, vulpine, and acutely piercing. His forehead was high. His voice was very low, soft, and insinuating. The Erie Railroad, running from New York City to Buffalo, and thence westward to Chicago, was started in 1832. In New York State alone, irrespective of gifts in other states, it received what was virtually a gift of $3 million of state funds and $3,217,000 interest, making $6,217,000 in all. Counties, municipalities, and towns through which it passed were prevailed upon to contribute freely donations of money, lands, and rights. From private proprietors in New York State, it obtained presents of land then valued at from $400,000 to $500,000, but now worth tens of millions of dollars. This is 100+ years ago in Gustavus Myers' time. In addition, an extraordinary series of special privileges and franchises was given to it. This process was manifolded in every state through which the railroad passed. The cost of construction and equipment came almost wholly from the grants of public funds. Confiding in the fair promises of its projectors, the people credulously supposed that their interests would be safeguarded. But from time to time, legislature after legislature was corrupted or induced to enact stealthy acts by which the railroad was permitted to pass without restriction into the possession of a small clique of exploiters and speculators. Not only were the people cheated out of funds raised by public taxation and advanced to build the road, a common occurrence in the case of most railroads, but this very money was claimed by the capitalist owners as private capital. Large amounts of bonds and stocks were issued against it, and the producers were assessed in the form of high freight and passenger rates to pay the necessary interest and dividends on those spurious issues. The speculator, Drew, gets control. Not satisfied with the theft of public funds, the successive cliques in control of the Erie Railroad continually plundered its treasury and defrauded its stockholders. So little attention was given to efficient management that shocking catastrophes resulted at frequent intervals. A time came, however, when the old locomotives, cars, and rails were in such a state of decay that the replacing of them could no longer be postponed. To do this, money was needed, and the treasury of the company had been continuously emptied by looting. The directors finally found a money loaner in Daniel Drew, an uncouth usurer. He had graduated from being a drover and tavern keeper to being owner of a line of steamboats plying between New York and Albany. He then, finally, had become a Wall Street banker and broker. For his loans, Drew exacted the usual required security. By 1855, he had advanced nearly $2 million, $500,000 in money, the remainder in endorsements. The Erie directors could not pay up, and the control of the railroad passed into his hands. As ignorant of railroad management as he was of books, he took no pains to learn. During the next decade, he used the Erie Railroad simply as a gambling means to manipulate the price of its stocks on the stock exchange. In this way, he fleeced a large number of dupes, decoyed into speculation out of an aggregate of millions of dollars. Old Cornelius Vanderbilt looked on with impatience. He foresaw the immense profits which would accrue to him if he could get control of the Erie Railroad. How he could give the road a much greater value by bettering its equipment and service, and how he could put through the same stock-watering operations that he did in his other transactions. Tens of millions of dollars would be his, if he could only secure control. Moreover, the Erie was likely at any time to become a dangerous competitor of his railroads. Vanderbilt secretly began buying stock. By 1866, he had obtained enough to get control. Drew and his dummy directors were ejected, Vanderbilt superseding them with his own. Vanderbilt ousts Drew, then restores him. The change was worked with Vanderbilt's habitual brusque rapidity. Drew apparently was crushed. He had, however, one final resource, and this he now used with histrionic effect. In tears, he went to Vanderbilt and begged him not to turn out and ruin an old self-made man like himself. The appeal struck home. Had the implorer been anyone else, Vanderbilt would have scoffed, but at heart he had a fondness for the old illiterate drover, whose career in so many respects resembled his own. Tears and pleadings prevailed. In a moment of sentimental weakness, a weakness which turned out to be costly, Vanderbilt relented. A bargain was agreed upon by which Drew was to resume directorship and represent Vanderbilt's interests and purposes. Reinstated in the Erie Board, Drew successfully pretended for a time that he was fully subservient. Ostensibly to carry out Vanderbilt's plans, he persuaded that magnate to allow him to bring in as directors 2 men whose pliancy, he said, could be depended upon. These were Jay Gould, demure and ingratiating, and James Fisk, Jr., a portly, tawdry, pompous voluptuary. In early life, Fisk had been a peddler in Vermont, and afterwards had managed an itinerant circus. Then he had become a Wall Street broker. Keen and suspicious as old Vanderbilt was, and innately distrustful of both of them, he nevertheless, for some inexplicable reason, allowed Drew to install Gould and Fisk as directors. He knew Gould's record, and probably supposed him, as well as Fisk, handy tools, as was charged, to do his quote-unquote dirty work without question. He put Drew, Gould, and Fisk on Erie's executive committee. In that capacity, they could issue stock and bonds, vote improvements, and generally exercise full authority. Drew, Gould, and Fisk betray Vanderbilt. At first, they gave every appearance of responding obediently to Vanderbilt's directions, believing it to his interest to buy as much Erie stock as he could, both as a surer guarantee of control and to put his own price upon it. Vanderbilt continued purchasing. The trio, however, had quietly banded to mature a plot by which they could wrest away Vanderbilt's control. This was to be done by flooding the market with an extra issue of bonds which could be converted into stock, and then by running down the price and buying in the control themselves. It was a trick that Drew had successfully worked several years before. At a certain juncture, he was apparently, quote, caught short, unquote, in the stock exchange and seemed ruined. But at the critical moment, he had appeared in Wall Street with 58,000 shares of stock, the existence of which no one had suspected. The shares had been converted from bonds containing an obscure clause during the conversion. The projection of this large number of shares into the stock market caused an immediate and violent decline in the price. By selling, quote-unquote, short, a Wall Street process which we have described elsewhere, Drew had taken in large sums as speculative winnings. The same ruse Drew, Gould, and Fisk now proceeded to execute on Vanderbilt. Apparently, to provide funds for improving the railroad, they voted to issue a mass of bonds. Large quantities of these they turned over to themselves as security for pretended advances of monies. These bonds were secretly converted into shares of stock and then distributed among brokerage houses, of which the three were members. Vanderbilt, intent upon getting in as much as he could, bought the stock in unsuspectingly. Then came revelations of the treachery of the three men and reports of their intentions to issue more stock. Vanderbilt did not hesitate a moment. He hurried to invoke the judicial assistance of Judge George C. Barnard of the New York State Supreme Court. He knew that he could count on Barnard, whom at this time he corruptly controlled. This judge was an unconcealed tool of corporate interests and of the plundering Boss Tweed political ring. For his many crimes on the bench, he was subsequently impeached. Barnard promptly issued a writ enjoining the Erie directors from issuing further stock and ordered them to return to the Erie Treasury 1/4 of that already issued. Furthermore, he prohibited any more conversion of bonds into stock on the ground that it was fraudulent. So pronounced a victory was this considered for Vanderbilt that the market price of Erie stock went up 30 points. But the plotters had a cunning trick in reserve. Pretending to obey Barnard's order, they had Fisk wrench away the books of stock from a messenger boy summoned ostensibly to carry them to a deposit place on Pine Street. They innocently disclaimed any knowledge of who the thief was. As for the messenger boy, he, quote, did not know, unquote. These 100,000 shares of stock Drew, Gould, and Fisk instantly threw upon the market. No one else had the slightest suspicion that the court order was being disobeyed. Consequently, Vanderbilt's brokers were busily buying in this load of stock in million-dollar bunches. Other persons were likewise purchasing. As fast as the checks came in, Drew and his partners converted them into cash. Gould and his partners flee with millions. It was not until the day's activity was over that Vanderbilt, amazed and furious, realized that he had been gouged out of $7 million. Other buyers were also cheated out of millions. The old man had been caught napping. It was this fact which stung him most. However, after the first paroxysm of frenzied swearing, he hit upon a plan of action. The very next morning, warrants were sworn out for the arrest of Drew, Fisk, and Gould. A hint quickly reached them. They thereupon fled to Jersey City, out of Barnard's jurisdiction, taking their cargo of loot with them. According to Charles Francis Adams, in his Chapters of Erie, one of them bore away in a hackney coach bales containing $6 million in greenbacks. The other two fugitives were loaded down with valets crammed with bonds and stocks. Here, in more than one sense, was an instructive and significant situation. Vanderbilt, the foremost blackmailer of his time, the plunderer of the national treasury during the Civil War, the arch-briber and corruptionist, virtuously invoking the aid of the law on the ground that he had been swindled. Drew, Gould, and Fisk sardonically jested over it. But joke as they well might over their having outwitted a man whose specialty was fraud, they knew that their position was perilous. Barnard's order had declared their sales of stock to be fraudulent and hence outlawed, and, moreover, if they dared venture back to New York, they were certain, as matters stood, of instant arrest, with the threatened alternative of either disgorging or of a criminal trial and possibly prison. To themselves they extenuated their thefts with the comforting and self-sufficient explanation that they had done to Vanderbilt precisely what he had done to others, and would have done to them. But it was not with themselves that the squaring had to be done, but with the machinery of law. Vanderbilt was exerting every effort to have them imprisoned. How was this alarming exigency to be met? They speedily found a way out. While Vanderbilt was thundering in rage, shouting out streaks of profanity, they calmly went ahead to put into practice a lesson that he himself had thoroughly taught. He controlled a sufficient number of judges. Why should not they buy up the legislature as he had often done? The strategic plan was suggested of getting the New York legislature to pass an act legalizing their fraudulent stock issues. Had not Vanderbilt and other capitalists often bought up Congress and legislatures and common councils? Why not now do the same? They well knew the approved method of procedure in such matters. An onslaught of bribing legislators, they reckoned, would bring the desired result. Gould bribes the legislature with $500,000. Stuffing $500,000 in his satchel, Gould surreptitiously hurried to Albany. Detected there and arrested, he was released under heavy bail, which a Confederate supplied. He appeared in court in New York City a few days later, but obtained a postponement of the action. No time was lost by him. Says Adams, he assiduously cultivated a thorough understanding between himself and the legislature, unquote. In the face of sinister charges of corruption, the bill legalizing the fraudulent stock issues was passed. Ineffectually did Vanderbilt bribe the legislators to defeat him. As fast as they took and kept his money, Gould debauched them with greater sums. One senator in particular, as we have seen, accepted $75,000 from Vanderbilt and $100,000 from Gould, and pocketed both amounts. A brief scandal naturally ensued. The usual effervescent expedient of appointing an investigating committee, here we go, was adopted by the New York State Senate on April 10, 1868. That's all those congressional investigating committees, Senate investigating committees are for, letting the heat out of the kitchen. That's it. Usually they find nothing, and even if they do find something, they don't do anything. This committee did not have to investigate to learn the basic facts. It already knew them. But it was a customary part of the farce of these investigating bodies to proceed with a childlike assumption of entire innocence. Many witnesses were summoned, and much evidence was taken. You guys, by the way, you know the 9/11 Whitewash Committee? That was one of those congressional investigation committees that was just designed to let the heat out of the kitchen and distort reality, to mollify the average idiot on the street. And then, of course, you had the Warren Whitewash Committee. Well, do you realize, regarding Pearl Harbor, right after World War II, they had one of those. It was called the Rutherford Committee. Same thing. Same thing. I forget what they found. I think they actually did find some dirt showing, even then, what's common knowledge among educated people now, that FDR and his cabinet well knew the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. The Dean of World War II Historians wrote that, John Toland, and several other authors. But the Rutherford Committee, there was another one. There's loads of congressional committees. Usually they find nothing. Sometimes they find something. Nothing ever happens. Nothing. It's part of the game. Okay, many witnesses were summoned and much evidence was taken. The committee reported that, according to Drew's testimony, $500,000 had been drawn out of the Erie Railroad's treasury, ostensibly for purposes of litigation, and that it was clear that, quote, large sums of money did come from the treasury of the Erie Railroad Company, which were expended for some purpose in Albany, for which no vouchers seem to have been filed in the offices of the company, unquote. The committee further found that, quote, large sums of money were expended for corrupt purposes by parties interested in legislation concerning railways during the session of 1868, unquote. But who specifically did the bribing? And who were the legislators bribed? These facts the committee declared that it did not know. The investigating sham resulted, as almost always happened in the case of similar inquisitions, in the culpability being thrown upon certain lobbyists, quote, who were enriched, unquote. These lobbyists were men whose trade it was to act as go-betweens in corrupting legislators. Gould and Thompson, the latter an accomplice, testified that they had paid Lou Payne, a lobbyist who subsequently became a powerful Republican politician, $10,000, quote, for a few days' services in Albany in advocating the Erie Bill, unquote. And it was further brought out that $100,000 had been given to the lobbyists Luther Caldwell and Russell F. Hicks to influence legislation and also to shape public opinion through the press. Caldwell, it appeared, received liberal sums from both Vanderbilt and Gould. A subsequent investigating committee appointed in 1873 to inquire into other charges reported that in the 1 year 1868, the Erie Railroad directors, comprising Drew, Gould, Fisk, and their associates, had spent more than $1 million for, quote, extra and legal services, unquote, and that it was, quote, their custom from year to year to spend large sums to control elections and to influence legislation, unquote. Vanderbilt later succeeded in compelling the Erie Railroad to reimburse him for the sums that he thus corruptly spent in fighting Drew, Gould, and Fisk. Their huge thefts having been legalized, Drew, Gould, and Fisk returned to Jersey City, but their path was not yet clear. Vanderbilt had various civil suits in New York against them. Moreover, they were adjudged in contempt of court. Parleying now began, with the severest threats of what the courts would do if they refused. Vanderbilt demanded that they buy back the shares of stock that they had unloaded upon him. Drew was the first to compromise. Gould and Fisk shortly afterward followed. They collectively paid Vanderbilt $2,500,000 in cash, $1,250,000 in securities for 50,000 Erie shares, and another $1 million for the privilege of calling upon him for the remaining 50,000 shares at any time within 4 months. Although this settlement left Vanderbilt out of pocket to the extent of almost $2 million, he consented to abandon his suits. The three now left their lair in Jersey City and transferred the Erie offices to the Grand Opera House at 8th Avenue and 23rd Street, New York City. In this collision with Vanderbilt, Gould learned a sharp lesson he thereafter never overlooked, namely, that it was not sufficient to bribe common councils and legislatures. He, too, must own his own judges. Events showed that he at once began negotiation. Oh, wow. All right, we'll take a break here. All of this corruption. Why don't other history books tell us this? The Bible tells us this about human nature. Okay, take a break here. See you in a few minutes. Okay, we're back. Here we go. We're continuing on with Chapter 10 of Volume 3 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. Gould and Fisk throw over Drew. The next development was characteristic. Having no longer any need for their accomplice, Gould and Fisk, by tactics of duplicity, gradually sheared Drew and turned him out of the management to degenerate into a financial derelict. It was Drew's odd habit, whenever his plans were crossed or he was depressed, to rush off to his bed, hide himself under the coverlets, and seek solace in sighs and self-compassion or in prayer. For with all his unscrupulousness, he had an orthodox religious streak. When Drew realized that he had been plundered and betrayed, as he had so often acted to others, he sought his bed, and there remained in despair under the blankets. The whimsical old extortionist never regained his wealth or standing. Upon Drew's effacement, Gould caused himself to be made president and treasurer of the Erie Railroad, and Fisk vice president and controller. When Gould and Fisk began to turn out more watered stock, various defrauded, malcontent stockholders resolved to take an intervening hand. This was a new obstacle, but it was coolly met. Gould and Fisk brought in gangs of armed thugs to prevent these stockholders from getting the physical possession of the books of the company. Then the New York legislature was again corrupted. A bill called the Classification Act, drafted to ensure Gould and Fisk's legal control, was enacted. This bill provided that only 1/5 of the board of directors should be retired in any year. By this means, although the majority of stockholders might be opposed to the Gould-Fisk management, it would be impossible for them to get possession of the road for at least 3 years, and full possession for not less than 5 years. But to prevent the defrauded stockholders from getting possession of the railroad through the courts, another act was passed. This provided that no judgment to oust the board of directors could be rendered by any court unless the suit was brought by the Attorney General of the state. It was thus only necessary for Gould and Fisk to own the Attorney General entirely, which of course they took pains to do, in order to close the courts to the defrauded stockholders. On a trumped-up suit, and by an order of one of Boss Tweed's judges, a receiver was appointed for the stock owned by foreign stockholders, and when any of it was presented for record in the transfer book of the Erie Railroad, the receiver seized it. In this way, Gould and Fisk secured practical possession of $6 million of the $50 million of stock held abroad. Alliance with corrupt politics and judiciary. From 1868 to 1872, Gould, abetted by subservient directors, issued 250,000 more shares of stock. The frauds were made uncommonly easy by having the Tweed machinery as an auxiliary. In turn, Boss Tweed, up to 1871, controlled the New York City and state dominant political machine, including the legislature and many of the judges. To ensure Tweed's connivance, they made him director of the Erie Railroad, besides heavily bribing him. With Tweed as an associate, they were able to command the judges who owed their elevation to him. Barnard, one of Tweed's servile tools, was sold over to Gould and Fisk, and so thoroughly did this judge prostitute his office at their behest that once, late at night, at Fisk's order, he sportively held court in the apartment of Josie Mansfield, Fisk's mistress. When the English stockholders sent over a large number of shares to be voted in for a new management, it was Barnard who allowed this stock to be voted by Gould and Fisk. At another time, Gould and Fisk called at Barnard's house and obtained an injunction while he was eating breakfast. It was largely by means of this corrupt alliance with the Tweed ring that Gould was able to put through this gigantic fraud of a series of frauds from 1868 to 1872. Gould was, indeed, the unquestioned mastermind in these transactions. Fisk and the others merely executed his directions. The various fraudulent devices were of Gould's origination. A biographer of Fisk casually wrote at the time, quote, Jay Gould and Fisk took William M. Tweed into their board and the state legislature. Tammany Hall and the Erie Ring were fused together and have contrived to serve each other faithfully, unquote. Gould admitted before a New York State Assembly investigating committee in 1873 that, in the 3 years prior to 1873, he had paid large sums to Tweed and to others, and that he had also disbursed large sums, quote, which might have been used to influence legislation or elections, unquote. These sums were facetiously charged on the Erie books to, quote, India rubber account, unquote, whatever that meant. Gould cynically gave more information. He could distinctly recall, he said, that, quote, he had been in the habit of sending money into various districts throughout the state, unquote, either to control nominations or elections for senators or members of the assembly. He considered, quote, that, as a rule, such investments paid better than to wait until the men got to Albany, unquote. Significantly, he added that it would be as impossible to specify the numerous instances, quote, as it would be to recall the number of freight cars sent over the Erie Railroad from day to day, unquote. His corrupt operations, he indifferently testified, extended into 4 different states. Quote, in a Republican district, I was a Republican. In a Democratic district, a Democrat. In a doubtful district, I was doubtful. But I was always for Erie, unquote. The funds that he thus used in widespread corruption came obviously from the proceeds of his great thefts. And he might have added with equal truth that with this stolen money he was able to employ some of the most eminent lawyers of the day and purchase judges. Gould's trading class support. Those writers who are content with surface facts, or who lack understanding of popular currents, either state or leave the inference that it was solely by bribing and trickery that Gould was able to consummate his frauds. Such assertions are altogether incorrect. To do what he did required the support or at least tolerance of a considerable section of public opinion. This he obtained. And how? By posing as a zealous anti-monopolist, of course. The cry of anti-monopoly was the great fetish of the entire middle class. I'm not familiar with that word. What is a fetish? I'm going to have to look that one up. This class viewed with fear the growing concentration of wealth, and as its interests were reflected by a large number of organs of public opinion, it succeeded in shaping the thoughts of no small a section of the working class. While secretly bribing, Gould constantly gave out for public consumption a plausible string of arguments in which act, by the way, he was always fertile. He represented himself as the champion of the middle and working classes in seeking to prevent Vanderbilt from getting a monopoly of many railroads. He played adroitly upon the fears, the envy, and the powerful mainsprings of the self-interest of the middle class by pointing out how greatly it would be at the mercy of Vanderbilt should Vanderbilt succeed in adding the Erie Railroad and other railroads to his already formidable list. It was a time of all times when such arguments were bound to have an immense effect. It's probably the time that was the wellspring, the foundation, the spring from which guys like Gustavus Myers came into being. He was a product. He probably was a child at this time. I'm talking about the muckraking journalists. They sprang up from this period. So this is what did it. This public opinion was unusually keen on what these robber barons were doing. Of course, they still couldn't stop it. And that they did was shown by the readiness with which the trading class excused his corruption and frauds, on the ground that he seemed to be the only man who proved that he could prevent Vanderbilt from gobbling up all of the railroads leading from New York City. With a great fatuousness, the middle class supposed that he was fighting for its cause. The bitterness of large numbers of the manufacturing, jobbing, and agricultural classes against Commodore Vanderbilt was deep-seated. By an illegal system of preferential freight rates to certain manufacturers, Vanderbilt put these favorites easily in a position where they could undersell competitors. Thus, A.T. Stewart, one of the noted multimillionaire manufacturers and merchants of the day, instead of owing his success to his great ability, as has been set forth, he really derived it to a great extent from the secret preferential freight rates that he had on the Vanderbilt railroads. A variety of other coercive methods were used by Vanderbilt. Special freight trains were purposely delayed and run at snail's pace in order to force shippers to pay the extraordinary rates demanded for shipping over the Merchant's Dispatch, a fast freight line owned by the Vanderbilt family. These were but a few of the many schemes for their private graft that the Vanderbilts put in force. The agricultural class was taxed heavily on every commodity shipped. For the transportation of milk, for example, the farmer was taxed 1/2 of what he received himself for the milk. These taxes, of course, eventually fell upon the consumer, but the manufacturer and the farmer realized that if the extortions were less, their sales and profits would be greater. They were in a rebellious mood and gladly welcomed a man, such as Gould, who thwarted Vanderbilt at every turn. Gould well knew of this bitter feeling against Vanderbilt. He used it and thrust himself forward constantly in the guise of the great deliverer. As for the small stockholders of the Erie Railroad, Gould easily pacified them by holding out the bait of a larger dividend than they had been getting under the former regime. This he managed by the common and fraudulent expedient of issuing bonds and paying dividends out of proceeds. So long as the profits of these small stockholders were slightly better than they had been getting before, they were complacently satisfied to let Gould continue his frauds. This acquiescence in theft has been one of the most pronounced characteristics of the capitalistic investors, both large and small, all of which your corporate pastors are in favor of and tell you to go out and vote for. Numberless instances have shown that they raise no objections to plundering management, provided that under it their money returns are increased. The end of Gould's looting of the Erie Railroad was now in sight. However, the small stockholders might assent. The large English stockholders, some of whom had invidious schemes of their own, in the way of which Gould stood, were determined to gain control themselves. Gould's directors bribed to resign. They made no further attempt to resort to the law. A fund of $300,000 was sent over by them to their American agents with which to bribe a number of Gould's directors to resign. As Gould had used these directors as catspaws, they were aggrieved because he had kept all of the loot himself. If he had even partly divided, their sentiments would have been quite different. The $300,000 bribery fund was distributed among them, and they carried out their part of the bargain by resigning. The Assembly Investigating Committee of 1873 referred carelessly to the English stockholders as being, quote, impatient at the law's delay, unquote, and therefore taking matters into their own hands. If a poor man or a trade union had become, quote, impatient at the law's delay, quote, unquote, and sought an illegal remedy, the judiciary would have quickly pronounced condign punishment and voided the whole proceeding. The boasted, quote, majesty of law, unquote, was a majesty to which the underdogs only were expected to look up to in fear and trepidation. When the English stockholders elected their own board, Gould obtained an injunction from the courts. This writ was absolutely disregarded, and the anti-Gould faction, on March 11, 1872, seized possession of the offices and books of the company by physical force. Did the courts punish these men for criminal contempt? No effort was made to. Many a worker or labor union leader had been sent to jail and has been since for, quote, contempt of court, unquote. But the courts, evidently, have been willing enough to stomach all of the contempt profusely shown for them by the puissant rich. The propertyless owned nothing, not to speak of a judge, but the capitalists owned whole strings of judges, and those whom they did not own or corrupt were generally influenced to their side by association or environment. Reported the Assembly Investigating Committee of 1873, speaking of the means employed to overthrow Gould, quote, all of this has been done without authority of law, unquote. But no law was invoked by the officials to make the participants account for their illegal acts. The legislature bribed again. It seems that the entire amount, including the large fees paid to agents and lawyers, corruptly expended by the English capitalists in ousting Gould, was $750,000. Did they foot this bill out of their own pockets? By no means. They arranged the reimbursements by voting this sum to themselves out of the Erie Railroad Treasury. That is to say, they compelled the public to shoulder it by adding to the bonded burdens on which the people were taxed to pay interest. To complete their control, they bribed the New York legislature to repeal the Classification Act. As has been shown, the legislature of 1872 was composed of a quote-unquote reform body. And it also has been brought out how Vanderbilt bribed it to give him invaluable public franchises and large grants of public money. In fact, other railroad magnates as well as he systematically bribed, and it is clear that they contributed jointly a pool of money both to buy laws and to prevent the passage of objectionable acts. Reported the Assembly Investigating Committee of 1873, quote, it appears conclusive that a large amount, reported by one witness at $100,000, was appropriated for legislative purposes by the railroad interest in 1872, and that this $30,000 was Erie's proportion, unquote. One of the lobbyists, James D. Barber, quote, a ruling spirit in the Republican Party, unquote, admitted receiving $50,000 from the Vanderbilts. While uniting to suppress bills feared by them all, each of the magnates bribed to foil the other's purposes. Gould's direct Erie thefts were $12 million. What did Gould's plunder amount to? His direct thefts, by reason of his Erie frauds, seem to have reached more than $12 million, all or nearly all of which he personally kept. That's some, considering the falling prices of commodities after the Panic of 1873, and comparable with current standards of cost and living, was equivalent to perhaps double the amount at present. Various approximations of his thefts were made. After a minute examination of the Erie Railroad's books, Augustus Stein, an expert accountant, testified before the quote-unquote Hepburn Committee, parentheses, the New York Assembly Investigating Committee of 1879, end parentheses, that Gould had himself pocketed $12 or $13 million. This, however, was only one aspect. Between 1868 and 1873, Gould and his accomplices had issued $64 million of watered stock. Gould, so the Erie books revealed, had charged $12 million as representing the outlay for construction and equipment. Yet not a new rail had been laid, nor a new engine put in use, nor a new station built. These 12 millions or more were what he and his immediate accomplices had stolen outright from the Erie Railroad treasury. It's like dictators in third world countries. They steal it all and the people get nothing. That's what these robber barons are. They're little dictators. Not so little, though, when you consider they're the real rulers of this country. Considerable sums were, of course, paid corruptly to politicians, but Gould got them all back, as well as the plunder of his associates, by personally manipulating Erie stock so as to compel them to sell at a great loss to themselves and a great profit to himself. Furthermore, in these manipulations of stock, he scooped in more millions from other sources. Gould might have been allowed to retain, had it not been for his intense greed and his constitutional inability to remain true to his Confederates, Gould might have been allowed to retain the proceeds of his thefts. His treachery to one of them, Henry N. Smith, who had been his partner in the brokerage firm of Smith, Gould, and Martin, resulted in trouble. Gould cornered the stock of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. To put it more plainly, he bought up the outstanding available supply of shares and then ran the price up from 75 to 250. Smith was one of a number of Wall Street men badly mulcted in this operation. What does mulcted mean? Well, this book's going to improve my vocabulary at least. And this was what Gould intended. Seeking revenge, Smith gave over the firm's books, which were in his possession, to General Barlow, counsel for the Erie Railroad's protesting stockholders. Evidence of great thefts was quickly discovered, and an action was started to compel Gould to disgorge about $12 million. A criminal proceeding was also brought, and Gould was arrested and placed under heavy bonds. An extraordinary, quote-unquote, restitution. Apparently, Gould was trapped, but a wonderful and unexpected development happened which filled the Wall Street Legion with admiration for his craft and audacity. He planned to make his very restitution the basis for taking in many more millions by speculation. He knew that when it was announced that he had concluded to disgorge, the market value of the stock would instantly go up and numerous buyers would appear. Secretly, he bought up as much Erie stock as he could, Then he ostentatiously, and with the widest publicity, declared his intention to make restitution. Such a cackling sensation it made. The price of Erie stock at once bounded up, and his brokers sold quantities of it, to his great accruing profit. The pursuing stockholders assented to his offer to surrender his control of the Erie Railroad and to accept real estate and stocks seemingly worth $6 million. But after the stockholders had withdrawn their suits, they found that they had been tricked again. The property that Gould had turned over to them did not have a market value of more than $200,000. Gould's thefts from the Erie Railroad were, however, only one of his looting transactions during those busy years. At the same time, he was using these stolen millions to corner the gold supply. In this, quote-unquote, Black Friday conspiracy, for so it was styled, he fraudulently reaped another $11 million to the accompaniment of a financial panic, with a long train of failures, suicides, and much disturbance and distress, all of which Jesus Christ on Judgment Day will hold him accountable. Right? All right. You've been listening to It's Chapter 10 of Volume 3 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. I'm Gordon Comstock. This is the Ministry of Truth, over and out. By 1855, he had advanced nearly $2 million, $500,000 in money, the remainder in endorsements. The Erie directors could not pay up, and the control of the railroad passed into his hands. As ignorant of railroad management as he was of books, he took no pains to learn. During the next decade, he used the Erie Railroad simply as a gambling means to manipulate the price of its stocks on the stock exchange. In this way, he fleeced a large number of dupes, decoyed into speculation out of an aggregate of millions of dollars. Old Cornelius Vanderbilt looked on with impatience. He foresaw the immense profits which would accrue to him if he could get control of the Erie Railroad. How he could give the road a much greater value by bettering its equipment and service, and how he could put through the same stock-watering operations that he did in his other transaction. His forehead was high. His voice was very low, soft, and insinuating. The Erie Railroad, running from New York City to Buffalo, and thence westward to Chicago, was started in 1832. In New York State alone, irrespective of gifts in other states, it received what was virtually a gift of $3 million of state funds and $3,217,000 interest, making $6,217,000 in all. Counties, municipalities, and towns through which it passed were prevailed upon to contribute freely donations of money, lands, and rights. From private proprietors in New York State, it obtained presents of land then valued at from $400,000 to $500,000, but now worth tens of millions of dollars. This is 100-plus years ago in Gustavus Myers' time. In addition, an extraordinary series of special privileges and franchises was given to it. This process was manifold. Drew gets control. Not satisfied with the theft of public funds, the successive cliques in control of the Erie Railroad continually plundered its treasury and defrauded its stockholders. So little attention was given to efficient management that shocking catastrophes resulted at frequent intervals. A time came, however, when the old locomotives, cars, and rails were in such a state of decay that the replacing of them could no longer be postponed. To do this, money was needed, and the treasury of the company had been continuously emptied by looting. The directors finally found a money loaner in Daniel Drew, an uncouth usurer. He had graduated from being a drover and tavern keeper to being owner of a line of steamboats plying between New York and Albany. He then, finally, had become a Wall Street banker and broker. For his loans, Drew exacted the usual required security in every state through which the railroad passed. The cost of construction and equipment came almost wholly from the grants of public funds. Confiding in the fair promises of its projectors, the people credulously supposed that their interests would be safeguarded. But from time to time, legislature after legislature was corrupted or induced to enact stealthy acts by which the railroad was permitted to pass without restriction into the possession of a small clique of exploiters and speculators. Not only were the people cheated out of funds raised by public taxation and advanced to build the road, a common occurrence in the case of most railroads, but this very money was claimed by the capitalist owners as private capital. Large amounts of bonds and stocks were issued against it, and the producers were assessed in the form of high freight and passenger rates to pay the necessary interest and dividends on those spurious issues. This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Here we go. Chapter 10 now of The History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. If you're not appreciating this book, what's wrong with you? Okay, Chapter 10. The second stage of the Gould fortune. The first medium by which Jay Gould transferred many millions of dollars to his own ownership was by his looting and wrecking of the Erie Railroad. If physical appearance were to be accepted as a gauge of capacity, none would suspect that Gould contained the elements of one of the boldest and ablest financial marauders that the system in force had as yet produced. About 5 feet 6 inches in height and of slender figure, he gave the random impression of being a mild, meek man, characterized by excessive timidity. His complexion was swarthy and partly hidden by closely trimmed black whiskers. His eyes were dark, vulpine, and acutely piercing.